I'm trying a new technique with my minis painting. So for the first time, I'm working on figures that need to be assembled and painted. So these figures come in a lot of tiny little pieces that need to be glued together and of course painted up in order to create the minis. Fortunately, I had seen a couple of really helpful videos about sub-assemblies and painting with sub-assemblies that I found useful, and I've been experimenting with that technique, and I thought I would just share what I've learned so far. So right now I'm working on a set from Warhammer Underworlds Nightvault, and this particular set is Thundrik's Profiteers, which is made up of 5 cool little steampunk dwarves. And since my 5 dwarves are in various stages of assembly and completion, I thought now would be a good time to make this video to talk about what I've learned about sub-assemblies. I'm going to use one of the completed dwarves, Garrett Allenson, to explain why I want to paint in sub-assemblies. And to cut to the chase, it's really to make the painting easier. When you get into dealing with figures that are very three-dimensional with a lot of layers, for example, this fellow with his gear on his back and the weapons in front of him, it's easier to paint when these pieces are all separated from each other than to try to work around behind a sword, for instance, or try to get to the underneath parts of the backpack or the ones that are kind of behind his head here. It just saves having to do a lot of fancy pretzeling yourself around various components. In the process, of course, hitting the very wrong things and getting paint on the wrong parts and so on. So the whole purpose is to make the painting process easier. Now, not everybody uses it. For instance, one of my favorite minis painters on YouTube, the Bob Ross of minis painting, Brent from Goobertown Hobbies, I've never seen him do any sub-assembly painting. He seems to like to get his figures all glued together before he begins the painting process. So not everybody is interested in doing it in that manner. But let me show you the process that I used. The first thing I've done here is I've taken my trusty sprue clippers. I've clipped all the components off the sprues, but since I'm not immediately assembling the figures and putting them all together, I thought it was important to keep track of which piece is which, so that when it comes time to follow the assembly instructions, I'm not going to be completely lost and mixing pieces up. So I have all the pieces numbered. They're not going to necessarily stay in the correct numbers as I'm painting them, but as long as I know that these pieces correspond to these numbers, when it comes time to build the figure, I'll be good to go and won't have any trouble figuring out which piece is which. From here, I go on to the sort of time-consuming step, which is getting them ready to paint. So let me clear these out and show you that next step. Alright, here are 2 dwarves that I'm currently in the process of painting. I've only just started putting a little bit of paint on these ones. What I've done here is essentially I've stuck each of the pieces of the mini onto a basic old toothpick, and then stuck the toothpick into this pink insulation foam stuff that holds it up nicely for me. And then I've made sure to cover the parts that are going to be glued together with kind of a sticky putty or a stick tack. Now, the reason is I don't want to get paint or my spray sealer or anything like that on the bits that are going to be glued together, because for a good connection you want to be gluing bare plastic to bare plastic, especially if you're using something like a plastic cement that kind of sort of melts the plastic a little bit to stick the pieces together. So everything that's eventually going to be glued has to have this stick tack put onto it, which is kind of a pain. The other thing that's a bit of a pain can be to get the toothpick and the piece of the mini to be sort of stuck together in a firm way that's not going to wobble around while you're trying to paint it. So in some instances, I've been able to basically stick the toothpick right into a hole that another piece is going to be slotted into in order to paint it, and then sort of cover up that connection with a bit of the stick tack, the putty here. And just a brief note on that stuff, I was using this white sticky putty, but I found it was so sticky that when I tried to remove it after it was all painted, it was sticking to my fingers. It was not coming off easily. It was sticking to the parts I'd painted already. So it turned out to be a real pain to use. I don't even know what brand this is, unfortunately. But I decided to switch to a blue tack that I found was less kind of adhesive, that was able to peel off much more easily when I was finished with the process. So in some cases, as with the base here too, I was able to use an existing hole that the feet pegs will eventually get glued to stick the toothpick through that, and then again put some putty around the spots that I don't want to have paint on them. However, there were cases where I didn't have a convenient spot to put the toothpick, and I had to make use of some good old Gorilla Crazy Glue. I have this gel super glue that's not quite as runny as Crazy Glue. I just kind of pour out a little bit on my working surface. I actually use, when I'm painting and crafting minis and stuff, I use game boards from board games that I have picked up from the thrift shop for $1 or $2, and I use those old game boards as working surfaces. So I'll pour a bit of the glue, super glue gel, onto the board there, and then use another toothpick to basically get some glue on there and apply it. But in some cases, what I've done is the extension that's going to slot into a hole of another piece of the mini when it gets glued together, I've glued the toothpick to that extension and then again wrapped it with the putty so that that extension would not get painted over. And then when it comes time to eventually take it apart to put the mini together, I just have to carefully use my scalpel to cut the toothpick off of the part I've crazy glued it to, or super glued it to, I should say. But not every single piece of the mini has to be done separately too. For instance, this gun here had the tiniest little piece that was glued to the end, or that was to be attached to the end of it. So rather than try to keep that separate and paint that wee little piece, I decided to glue it on there ahead of time. I looked for other opportunities to pre-assemble some of the pieces, but I realized that anything I tried to do would create difficult workaround areas, and I thought for the rest of the pieces, other than this other gun too, had a similar deal where it had basically this tiny little piece on the end of it that I've glued on here. And the rest I've just chosen to keep as is and unassembled, just for the, like I said, the ease of painting. I guess I'll mention that after they're stuck on to the toothpicks and the putty is applied to cover the appropriate surfaces, at that point I give them a spray primer and then they're ready to paint. Once the painting process is fully complete on all the pieces, then I'm ready to take everything apart here and actually assemble the minis. So the first thing I do, like I said, is I take them off of the toothpicks. I carefully remove all the putty, try not to pull off any of the paint in the process. I've also at that point given it a spray of my clear coat, and once the mini is fully assembled, I'll give it a second spray of the clear coat. But for now, basically I take all the pieces off of the toothpicks and let me pull out my final dwarf to show you the finished process. Allow me to introduce you to Enric Ironhail here. This is my 5th dwarf and the second one that I've completed. So basically all the individual pieces, once the putty is removed, are ready to be glued together. At that point I can take out my plastic cement and assemble the mini, and once the mini is all together, at that point, like I said, first I want to touch up any spots that need to be touched up. There might be a couple of places in the joint between two pieces where there might be a bit of bare plastic or a bit of the putty that's managed to squeeze itself out, and at that point I can paint any finishing touches and corrections that I need to paint, and then put on my final coat of the clear coat. With this particular fellow, to represent the fact that he's a steampunk dwarf, I've added just a tiny bit of a cotton ball to show a little bit of steam coming out of here. But in the end, I was glad that I used this whole sub-assembly process, because I was looking at this figure thinking, he's got this giant gun that he's holding in front of him. It would be so hard to get behind that to paint his legs, for instance. And these two completed ones are actually the two smallest ones. The other ones have a couple layers of gear on their back or some other crazy stuff that's around the figure that would really make it difficult to paint around. So in the end, the process has worked really well for me, and that's why I decided I wanted to share it with you. And for you experienced painters out there, what do you think about my process? Is there anything that I could be doing better, more efficiently? Like I said, it's my very first time attempting such a thing, so I'm eager to hear any suggestions that you might have. Hey, it's Josh. You know why I'm here. Sometimes you just need that friendly reminder to give a little thumb up, to subscribe to the channel, to share the video with somebody who would enjoy it. Thanks so much for watching. Cheers. Good. Now, what I've done is I've used the feet will. What I will do is, and for you experienced